Welcome back. We're talking about the controversy surrounding potential changes in Japan's law permitting military engagement. Joining us from Beijing is the Executive Vice President at the Bao Forum for Asia, Xiyu. With us from the University of Connecticut is history professor and author Alexis Dudden. Independent journalist Yoichi Shimatsu joins us from Bangkok, and here in the studio is college professor and Brookings Institution scholar Katharine Moon. Yoichi, you mentioned earlier on that the Japanese Prime Minister just needs to carry a third of the electorate to stay in power. But we know that his support is declining, that there is growing opposition. Is it likely that his support could be corroded to the point where he could lose office?
Yeah, I believe so. Basically, the economy is not going well. Abenomics has not worked. He's been unable to cap the Fukushima nuclear problem. So on many fronts, Shinzo Abe has not really been an effective prime minister, and he's only held on because of this very unusual situation of the disorganization, disarray of the opposition. So presuming that the opposition will use this opportunity to put aside some of its differences and rebuild its coalition, presumably the Liberal Democrats will be challenged more and more. Of course, he doesn't have to schedule another elections for a while, so he will have free reign for a while. But we shall see how the economic crisis goes, because I think that will determine if the all-important business community decides they need somebody other than Shinzo Abe and his Abenomics policy. So the situation in Japan is very complex, and the security bill is tied into this whole political complex there.
And Xiyu, how is China likely to respond to these developments in Beijing? And do you think that this will be something that will be brought up in talks between the Americans and the Chinese?
Well, now the state of China-U.S. relation is getting more complicated than before. Both positive and negative things are developing. And so the expectation for the upcoming summit between Xi Jinping and Obama, President Xi Jinping and President Obama, is getting higher than before. Unfortunately, the challenge, the task for the productive summit will be very difficult, including differences between China and the U.S. on Japanese future role in the regional security, especially the current trends in Japan. So China has a very serious concerns. But first of all, issues within bilateral between U.S. and China will be at the top priority. I don't think Japanese affairs or development in Japan will be at the top agenda between President Xi Jinping and President Obama.
Kathy, this will have implications for the whole region, wouldn't it? It would affect other countries, like South Korea, for instance?
Sure, and we should just keep in mind that the South Korean president, President Park Geun-hye, will also be holding a visit with Mr. Obama in October, some weeks after Mr. Xi Jinping comes from China. And I am sure that this issue about Japan's security changes will be something that President Park would want to raise with Mr. Obama. The South Koreans, just like the Chinese, are very wary. They're very nervous about this situation in Japan. They are not afraid, I think, that Japan will become a militaristic society tomorrow. That's just not possible. But in terms of implications for the regional relationships, and especially in a situation where right now we have China, South Korea, and Japan discussing at this very moment a possible trilateral diplomatic meeting of very high officials to resume the kind of high-level diplomacy that had taken place some years ago and had been stopped because of Japan's history issues, especially under Mr. Abe. So given that there are some positive signals in the works, I think this security legislation, which seems like it will pass in mid-September, is going to become a wrench in the region. If I may add one thing, I think it's very important to keep in mind that the security legislation is not only a dangerous item for security reasons, but also for democracy in Japan. The U.S. prides itself on having helped develop and strengthened Japan's democracy over the decades, and Japan is really a flagship democracy in Asia. And yet, as my colleagues have mentioned, due process has been lacking regarding the security legislation. What I find shocking is that even before the lower house of the Diet had passed the security bill in July, the Ministry of Defense had already been working on this so-called collective security, collective self-defense, CSD policy that would be disseminated to the self-defense forces, even before the legislation is passed. So this is bureaucratic fiat. And I find that very disturbing. And I find the fact that hundreds of thousands of Japanese, for the first time in decades, are expressing their political opinions against this bill. The vast majority of the Japanese public, all public opinion polls show they are against the security legislation. And this, to me, is a situation where the people's voices really need to be heeded.
Right, but as you've pointed out, the Prime Minister has bypassed the need for any kind of constitutional change. He is going through the legislature to get this pushed through. Does the opposition in Japan have any legal recourse to this at the end of the day?
Well, the legal recourse, okay, let me go back. I'm not sure about the legal recourse. We'd have to ask scholars on that. But I think it's not so much the opposition parties, but the public that is opposing. I think they are serving a critical function. So we do know that Japanese legal scholars, constitutional scholars the majority of them have come out saying this is unconstitutional. The security legislation would be unconstitutional. So the opinions have already been forming. Whether the Japanese public can do something to stop it and to make Mr. Abe accountable for potential violations, should the legislation become passed, that's up for grabs.
Alexis, how do you think what is happening right now is going to change the relationship between China and Japan?
Between China and Japan, well, hopefully that's where what we are seeing on the streets in Japan can be a positive force. And I mean this very seriously, because what Yoichi pointed out, the disorganization of the opposition parties has left this void into which the people have emerged. And what they're saying is an entirely pacifist approach towards claiming democracy on the streets. And it's really quite amazing, especially in the most prominent of the younger groups. It's called SEALDS, Students' Emergency Action for a Liberal Democracy, and they are entirely pacifist themselves, bearing only microphones and doing very, kind of cool hipster dances, but they're showing the power of the people in a region, as Professor Moon pointed out, Japan is the clarion open society, and if Japan loses that ability or has it shut down, then that's actually a rather dark and ominous day for the entire region. At the same time, and it's actually kind of exciting, you've got senior conservative constitutional lawyers openly comparing the current administration in Japan to North Korea. Now, obviously, they're being sarcastic, but that's not something that the average constitutional lawyer would have said recently. Only yesterday or the day before, a former Supreme Court justice came out opposed to saying that this legislation is unconstitutional. So should the legislation be ever taken to Japan's Supreme Court, which it could do, and by that point other developments would have happened, so who knows, but at least there's already quite a lot of precedent from the legal community in Japan saying that this is actually an unconstitutional reinterpretation of what collective self-defense means. So it comes down to these tiny technicalities, but what the people on the streets have really done is made clear that Article 9, the sovereign right to give up belligerency, is Japanese and Japanese identity.
Can I jump in for a minute?
Very quickly.
Yes. I think this is an ironic situation for Prime Minister Abe. He and his supporters have argued that the young generation of the Japanese need something passionate, a passionate identity, and that increasing Japan's power through the SDF becoming more normal is one part of it. I think what we see on the streets is that the Japanese younger generation do care And their identity is not only that they love Japan, a peaceful Japan, but that they have much more cosmopolitan values. So their nationalism and cosmopolitanism are married together, whereas Mr. Abe's is much more of a conventional, old-fashioned nationalism.
Xiyu, is there a diplomatic way out of this? As Kathy pointed out earlier on, there is a trilateral talks taking place on regional security. Is there a diplomatic way that this could be diffused?
I think high-level trilateral talks among the three countries are highly possible, especially after President Xi Jinping and President Park consulted recently ago. However, economically, highly possible. Security, trilateral, I don't think the situation is matured enough for the three countries to sit together to discuss the security issues in this region. So hopefully later this year or early next year, the trilateral, very high-level trilateral meeting will take place, but focusing on economic cooperation because the common ground in economic area is greater than the other area among the three countries. We can start cooperation from the easier area gradually into the tougher and more difficult areas.